All right, welcome everyone to 10 Game Changing Mastering Lessons, a free webinar where I'm going to share with you some of the lessons that I've learned about mastering over the last several years, many of which I learned from my good buddy Ian Shepard, who is a fantastic veteran mastering engineer from Great Britain who has taught me so many things. And I'm actually going to talk about something that he's doing that's pretty cool at the end of the webinar. But between now and then, there's a lot of fun stuff to cover. And my goal here is to help you think about how you do mastering. Maybe you've never mastered before. Maybe you've done a bunch and you're frustrated. Maybe you feel like pretty confident in your skills and you just want to get a little bit better. Whatever the case, I should be able to give you lots of good stuff to get you rolling and get you moving. Okay. Um, all right, I'm seeing that there's no video. Uh, you should be able to see my screen right now where it says 10 game-changing mastering videos. You're not going to see my face. Let me know if those of you on the live webinar, let me know what's going on. Okay, you guys can see it. Wonderful. My mouse is moving. Okay, great. All right, so for those of you who are watching the recording, thank you for tuning in as well, and especially those of you who are here listening live. Thanks for hanging out with me. If you have questions, let them fly. I'll try to get to as many as I can. All right, so let's kick things off. First off, if you don't know who I am, which is possible, my name is Joe Gilder, and I'm the dude from Nashville, and I run Home Studio Corner. So if you got to this, a friend of a friend sent you the webinar registration or this video link, hey, nice to meet you. I'm Joe. I'm a audio engineer. I teach people about getting good recordings in home studios. So that's what this is all about today. But more importantly, over the last several years, I've managed to go from being confused and frustrated about mastering to actually enjoying it and being confident in my ability to produce a quality master out of my home studio. Now, that's not a pat myself on the back sort of thing. That's just, I was just like probably a lot of you in this webinar. I could not be more frustrated with mastering. It seems like, okay, I know there's a limiter involved, but what else do you do? Do you just make it louder? Is that it? Is there more to it? What's going on here? So I can relate a lot to your frustration and the things you might be feeling in the same way. And I've been able to, and this is a constant learning process. I'm not saying I've arrived, but I've come a long way, and I'm really fairly confident in my ability to do a good mastering job out of a home studio. Now, you may say, do you really have a home studio? I really do. I'm just in a spare bedroom in the basement of my house with some treatment, but I haven't done any major remodeling. It's not, you know, nothing crazy like that. Okay. That's what we got going on here. Okay, so I learned a lot of what I learned about mastering was from the master, Ian Shepard. If you don't know Ian, he's a great guy. He runs the Production Advice website. Uh, he mastered my last album, actually, which I trusted him. I said, dude, please master my album. I also learned a lot from trying lots of things and making lots of mistakes. So that's kind of the 1-2 punch here. You're going to have to try a lot of things, but mastering is one of those things that it's hard to just get in there and try stuff because it's just such a mystery. You're not sure even what to try. When you're recording something, you can move a microphone and try a different position and get a better sounding guitar. When you're mastering, you don't really know what that quote moving the microphone really looks like. So it can be pretty frustrating, and I totally understand. So hopefully today I'm going to give you a lot of kind of starting points for you to try on your masters, and then also you can go and try lots of things and change up what I'm showing you and see what kind of results you get. So what to expect from this webinar? Obviously, I'm going to give you my 10 game-changing mastering lessons that I've learned. Also going to have a Q&A time at the end. So I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for you to ask your questions and hopefully for me to give you some answers and help you out there. And then there will be a chance to dive deeper and learn more at the end, but that's at the very end, and I'll tell you about that later. But first, let's go over these 10 game-changing mastering lessons. Let me jump in. Hang on one second. Let me do this here. Oop. Okay. All right. So the deal with this is when I say game changing, I sat down and spent some time going through all the things that I've learned the last several years. Okay. The things that frustrated me, the things that when I tried it, it actually got me a good result. Now, it may not be a game changing thing for you, but for me, these are 10 things that when I tried them, it made a humongo difference in how in how I master and every stage of the mastering process, and in both how I listen and how I actually put in the plugins and all those sorts of things. Um, and real quick, live on the web, I see Scott. Scott, I don't know if you can hear me. That's a issue on your part. So either way, not sure what's going on. Okay, all right, back to the webinar. Things are being weird with GoToMeeting, but we'll figure it all out. Okay, so let me get into the list here. Sorry, I was dealing with a setting that was messing things up here. Here we go. Here is the very first one, and this is probably one of the biggest takeaways. If you just write this one down and don't do anything else, if you just leave the webinar now, write this down, and that is to leave it alone. It is so tempting with all things audio, whether it's mixing, editing, or mastering, or any other process. It's so easy to spend a lot of time doing stuff to the audio. You think, okay, I've got this song. Someone's asking me to master it. I need to do EQ, compression, multiband compression, limiting, stereo widening, a little bit of reverb, and you just start adding and adding and adding and adding. Now, there are times where I've done all of those things, right? There are times where I have completely, had a huge whole list of stuff and plugins on my channel, but it's actually it's been necessary. But a lot of times where I really get hung up is where I start adding things because I just think I probably need to add this. Oh, I probably need to add that, and the it just ruins things. And I've had so many mastering sessions, especially starting out when I was really getting serious about mastering, where I would start and I would add a bunch of things and it would just start to sound worse and worse and worse. And so I'd add another plugin to try to fix what I just broke with the previous plugin. And it was so frustrating. And now there have been sessions I've done recently for paid sessions for clients where I'm mixing and mastering an album, or maybe just mastering, where I will literally some songs will have nothing but a limiter on them and just a tiny bit of limiting, maybe a single band of EQ that just to carve out a little bit of space that was a little much there. And then I leave it alone. So that's a really important, it really is a game-changing lesson. If you can learn the importance of leaving things alone, just leave it alone. Maybe type this up and put it on your computer. Leave it alone. You can get a long way with that, because especially if you're working on quality stuff. I feel like that should be a given, but you've heard me talk all the time about getting things right at the source and about making the recording itself sound as good as possible, and then focusing on the mix and making the mix sound as good as possible. So by the time you get to the mastering stage, ideally there shouldn't be a lot you're doing, but in getting a decent level across the entire album and converting it to an MP3. I mean, that should be that easy sometimes, and it's okay if it is. The thing I want you to take away is it's okay if you leave stuff alone. No one's going to know if you used 10 plugins or one plugin. They're just not. And if they ask you, that's a part of your job, is to know when to add a bunch of stuff and when to leave it alone. Okay? All right, so that's number one. I feel like that's the most important, so I put it first in the list. Next up is, okay, this one is going to take a minute to explain, and you may disagree with me, and that's okay. I will allow it. Uh, this is a big one. Headroom and dynamic range are not the same thing. I hear this all the time in various, all over the place, forums, even in print and other magazines and things, especially online, where people are just spouting off information, and they'll say things like, "You when you're mastering, when you're mixing a song, you want to leave." Uh, 6 to 10 dB of headroom in the mix so that the mastering engineer has room to work. Now, maybe I've said that in the past. I'm sure I have. I've said lots of things. Maybe you've said that yourself. Maybe you've heard that before. Maybe you thought that was true, but I think there's a danger there. There's two very different things at play. There's dynamic range and there's headroom. Headroom is literally just the space that you have between your loudest peak of the song and clipping. So if your loudest peak in the song hits at -10, you have a headroom of 10 dB. Now, the thing people will confuse is they'll say if they mix quietly, where their average level is at -20 and they're peaking around -6 or something like that, then they think they're leaving 6 dB of headroom and they're thinking there's tons of dynamic range. That's not necessarily true. For example, this month at Dueling Mixes, if you're not familiar with that, that's where Graham Cochran and I each mix a song every month in kind of a competition style training course. And so when right before the month, the previous when we get the files ready to deliver to our members, Graham's mix and my mix are usually at different levels, and so I will level match them so that they sound roughly the same level before we present them to our members, right? And I don't do any limiting. I don't change the tone at all. I'm literally just measuring the actual volume, the average volume of each song, and then I level match them. And one of the interesting things that I discovered this past month, that normally Graham mixes things a little bit hotter. His mixes are louder, and usually his mixes also have a little bit less dynamic range. They're not squashed by any means, but his mix might have a dynamic range of 12, and mine will have a dynamic range of 14. And my mix will also be quiet. The thing that you tend to want to assume then is because my mix is quiet, it has a greater dynamic range. And so let me stop there for a second. Maybe you don't know what dynamic range is. Dynamic range is simply the amount of volume space between the loudest and quietest sections of the song. As you decrease dynamic range, which is what mastering does that to some degree, you're decreasing how much difference of volume there is between the quiet and the loud parts of the song. When you get down to a dynamic range of 8 or 7 or below, it starts to sound very squashed. A lot of commercially released music, if you drop it into some sort of a tool that measures dynamic range, it'll clock in at maybe 5, 4, sometimes 3. That's it's just and it you can tell if you're used to listening to this stuff, you can tell it's just slammed and has no life, no thump, no punch, no nothing. And Ian Shepherd's done this whole dynamic range day event that he's done a couple years now, where they talk about that and give you examples of. There's an example of a Michael Jackson song. I forget which one it is, but they play the original mastered version, and then as it was remastered over the last few decades to be louder and louder and louder and have less dynamic range. When you level match those, the one from 30 years ago sounds way better than the one from 5 years ago because it has dynamic range. It's allowed to be musical. Music has dynamics. And so when we constrain it too much, it can kill the music. And so when I say dynamic range, that's what I'm talking about. You typically want a dynamic range of, when you're mastering, of no more than 8 for really heavy stuff. If it gets up above 8, I'm getting worried. I usually leave stuff around 10 to 12, and 8's kind of for the heavier stuff. But the interesting thing, back to my story about dueling mixes, this past month when I was level matching the mixes, I noticed something. Graham's mix was much louder than mine. You could just look at the waveforms. His mix was very loud. It peaked at around maybe -2, -3. My mix was way quieter. My mix peaked at probably -9. So there's probably 8 dB difference in volume between the two mixes. But when I used the loudness detection button inside of Studio One in their mastering suite, where it measures the peaks, the loudest and softest parts, and then actually gives you the dynamic range. My mix, the quieter mix, had less dynamic range than Graham's mix, which was much louder. Meaning my mix had overall more compression than Graham's mix. Now mine was 12 dB of dynamic range, and Graham's was 14, so it wasn't like this huge difference. But my quieter mix had less dynamic range. So if you carry that out to like its logical conclusion, then if you can have a mix that is super, super, super quiet, that is squashed to death. Okay. And you can have a mix that's really, really, really loud that has tons of dynamic range. The headroom, how much distance there is between the peaks of the mix and clipping, 0 dB full scale, that difference has no impact, means nothing when it comes to dynamic range. That's literally just a matter of turning things up and down and increasing volume to get a mix that peaks at -6 to where it peaks at -1 or close to 0. That's all a mastering engineer would do to get it up to that level, and then they would do things like limiting and compression and things like that. But that's just a big misconception. So the takeaway point, this is getting pretty technical, I know, for point number 2. I promise the rest of these points are not nearly as technical as this, but it's something that I just heard said over and over and over, and I don't think it's accurate. Now I could be wrong, but I'm going to take my stance here. Headroom is just a matter of how close we are to clipping. Dynamic range is how much we've squashed it. I'm much more concerned with dynamic range. And if you listen to my mixes, or if you are a member of Dueling Mixes, or if you've been a member of my other products and memberships where I give you my final mixes of a mix, you'll notice they're pretty quiet. And I don't care. If my mix averages So if my mix peaks at 12 dB below clipping, okay, big deal. The mastering engineer just puts a gain plug in, turns it up maybe 12 dB, and then we're back to the same level as everybody else in the world. But I don't have to worry about clipping on my master fader, and I focus on not over compressing things. And that's been a big deal and has made a big difference in the sound of my masters by getting that right. And more so, this is more so a mixing tip, but it comes into play when you're mastering. Okay. Jim is saying, how do you measure the dynamic range of a song? Well, there are tools out there. Studio One has it built into their mastering suite in Studio One Pro. You just click a button and it measures the average level and the peak level. Essentially, the dynamic range is the difference between, I think it's the difference between the average level and the peak level. I think you have to I just use the tool and it does it. There's also a tool called TT Dynamic Range Meter that's put out by the Pleasurized Music Foundation. I think you can join them for about $30 and you get that plugin for quote unquote free. It used to be free, it's not anymore. But that's a good tool that actually gives you a real time measurement as you're mastering, and it also gives you an offline version where you can tell it to analyze the dynamic range of all the songs in a folder, and it'll quickly run through and tell you what the dynamic range of each one is. Pretty handy tool. Nelson asking if this is a live event. Yes, this is live. And for those of you who are having some audio issues earlier, I apologize. I am streaming audio. People are hearing me, so we're good. Mitch, these mixes you talking about are pre-master. Yes, the examples were pre-mastering, just talking about the mix itself. But when you're thinking about mastering, obviously you have to think a lot about mixing, and that whole dynamic range headroom thing comes into play a lot. Mick is asking, what was that tool again? It's called the TT Dynamic Range Meter. If you just search for TT Dynamic Range, it should pull up actually an article that Ian wrote about it on Google. You should be good. Neil has a quick question. So getting a good mix, be it quiet or loud, is key because a loud mix would need less mastering process. No, see, I feel like that, Neil, your question is kind of going after what a lot of people say that I don't think is true. The only mastering process, if my mix is quiet and your mix is loud, the only process that's different when it comes to mastering is turning it up. So if my mix needs to be turned up 6 dB, so it's at a louder level that's closer to what a mastered level would be, it's literally just a gain plugin that turns it up. It's just volume. You're not doing any other mastering quote unquote process at that point. You're just getting them all to the same level. On the flip side, though, if you give me a mix that's so loud, you had to put a limiter on your mix bus just to get it to not clip, then we're having issues because I've got to turn that down, and then I've got to somehow come up with a way to handle all the clipping and the limiting that was already happening in your mix. So that's why I tend to prefer to mix much quieter, so I'm not having to worry about any of that. And then when I master, or if I send it to someone else to master, they can just turn it up. I'm not mixing so low that there's all this noise that gets captured and things like that. I'm not mixing where there's nothing registering on the meter, but my master fader is maybe halfway up the meter, as opposed to a lot of people that really like to peg it. So that's just my little pet peeve. Okay, good questions. Let's move on to number 3. Set levels using meters, not how hard the limiter is working. Okay, now you may relate to this. This is how I would do quote unquote mastering for years. I would get a mix and I would put a limiter on there and I would pull the threshold down on the limiter until I saw that it was limiting. And then I just kept pulling it down until it sounded bad, to where maybe there was 3, 4, 5, 6 dB of gain reduction happening on the limiter pretty regularly, uh, maybe more. And when it started to sound really bad, I would just bring it back up a little bit. And that's how that was my level setting process. And as you can imagine, there's no way to really consistently do anything when you're using how much gain reduction is happening. Because I could master an album and the limiter could hit one song fairly hard because maybe the kick and the snare are really loud in that mix and they need to be tamed down a little bit. But the next song could be a really soft acoustic guitar ballad where the limiter hardly touches anything, maybe just a couple of loud vocal spots. If I treated those both the same, then that means for the rock song, I'd have a ton of limiting happening because there's a lot of loud stuff and it might actually sound pretty good. But then I move on to the ballad and I would start cranking that up and pulling that threshold down to get the same amount of limiting that was happening in the prior song, because I'm thinking if it has that much limiting going on, then they're going to be roughly the same volume. And yes, you can hear and listen and get roughly an idea of if they're at the same volume, but you're typically going by how much the limiter is working. Now, maybe none of you do that, and I'm the only idiot in the room who used to master like that, but it would just end up causing so many problems. And again, back to number one, the leave it alone idea. I was adding more limiting than I needed to because I didn't want my mixes to be too quiet. I knew I didn't want to over compress and over limit because that obviously does sound bad, but I did want my mixes to be nice and loud and punchy. My masters, I guess, is more a more accurate way to put it. So I would bring that threshold down until there was some limiting happening, and that's when I knew that I was mastering. Okay, the way to do it is to use your levels. Now, if you have a system, different every DAW is different. Pro Tools has new meters now. I've heard I use Studio One, which has just a basic RMS and peak meter, but also the K system metering, which I don't have time to go into. Maybe I'll do another webinar on that sometime in the future. I did do a video on it for my VIP members. If you're one of those, you can check that out. But it allows you to at least see where the average level of your mix is. The peaks don't matter so much as the average because the average level is where the volume is sitting. And the average level is a big part of what determines what the dynamic range of that master is. So if your average level, let's say you have your threshold, your limiter set at the end of the chain with a threshold at -1, just to give you some room in case any random peaks happen to stray through. And let's say your mix is at an average level of -20, which is kind of what I aim for when I'm mixing. At that point, you're probably not hitting the limiter at all without adding some gain to the mix. So you start to add gain to the mix or bring the threshold down on the limiter, whichever one is essentially the same thing. And then you start to see as the level, the average level of the mix increases, you'll start to see there is some limiting probably happening at the limiter. But you don't base the level, you keep increasing the gain, but you don't base the level on how much limiting is happening. You base it on where that level is hitting the meters. That's why I like the K system. It works off of the average level of the mix. I don't care what the peaks are. I don't care how much limiting is happening. I'm trying to get the level up to a certain point. So for me, and when I'm mastering an average level of around -14, where there's about 14 dB of quote unquote headroom above the average level, not the peak, but the average level of the mix, that tends to be a good spot because uh, now it's giving me plenty of room. And if I've done masters recently where I don't even look at the limiter, I don't look at how much it's limiting. I just turn it up till there's about a -14 average. Maybe it gets up to -12, -11 on the really loud parts of the song, and then I listen. And if it sounds great, it does. If it sounds weird, I'll look at the limiter and maybe it is hitting the limiter a little too hard. But I've almost always found if that's the approach that I take, then I'm not over compressing or over limiting almost any, which is awesome. Okay, you're not allowed to say your own stuff is awesome, but it's been an awesome. I told you these are game changing. These are big things that totally transformed how I do mastering. Okay, all right, let's move on to number 4. I see you guys have some good questions. I'm going to keep running so we get through this and have time for Q&A at the end. I can already tell there's going to be a lot of questions I'm not going to get to, so bear with me. I'll try to get to as many as I can. Okay, number 4, EQ is a stupid powerful tool. Absolutely. When I think about limiting, well, let's say rewind a decade. When I would think about mastering, I would think about a limiter. And that's the extent of my thoughts on mastering. Maybe a compressor and a limiter together to really get it loud. And EQ is just an afterthought. Maybe I would throw an EQ on there if it was a really bad mix that I did that had way too much low end, and I would EQ that down a little bit, but I didn't know what I was doing. When I would put an EQ on there and do things, it would sound different, but it wouldn't necessarily sound better. And I have learned, as I mentioned earlier, that so there are some masters that I do that have just a little bit of EQ. And this is something that I absolutely 100% attribute to Ian Shepherd in his home mastering EQ series. When I watched those videos, it was just like light bulb moment after light bulb moment where he went through and he essentially just went through slowly what essentially six or eight different specific frequencies sound like on the mastering level. Now, if you've watched my understanding EQ videos, you know that I teach you kind of an ear training tool to show you how to learn what different frequency ranges sound like. But it's mostly tailored towards mixing. So, where do the acoustic guitars live in a mix? Where does the bass live? Where do the vocals live? Where does the sibilance on a vocal live? So it does apply to mastering, but it was all done in kind of the context of mixing. But when you're mastering, there are certain ranges that you tend to go to. And Ian did a great job of going to things like 50 hertz, 100 hertz, 200, 400, I think maybe 800, and then 1K, 2K, I think maybe 5K, 10K, or something like that. It was kind of spread out like that. But it just if you've never done this before, go pull up a mix right after the webinar if you want. While you're listening to the webinar, I don't care. Pull up a mix, or pull up a mastering session and just put a stereo mix in there. Put an EQ on it, and then go to 50 hertz and just boost by 3 dB and listen to what changes. Then go to 100 hertz. I guarantee just noticing the difference between 50 and 100 hertz will transform how you mix. I used to think of the low end as 100 hertz and below. That's the lows. But man, 100 hertz sounds way different than 50. I mean, obviously it is an octave higher, but in the context of a mix, it just has a completely different impact. 50 hertz hits you in the chest. 100 hertz is a lot more full and can be a lot more troublesome than 50 hertz a lot of times, depending on the style of music and all that stuff. Now, going through the other frequency ranges is super helpful for where the vocals sit if you want to emphasize or de-emphasize vocals with EQ and things like that. But literally, just learning how to get 100 hertz and 50 hertz and kind of getting that settled in your head of how they fit together, man, makes a huge difference. Huge, 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 huge difference for me. So don't underestimate the power of EQ. Again, it may not need any EQ. Like we said before, you may not need to do anything. Maybe you just need to leave it alone. But chances are it will need some EQ. And don't underestimate just a couple of dB changes. Even 1 dB change in the right place can make a huge impact. Okay, next up, number 5, cut it in half. So along the lines of EQ, you're going to be excited when you kind of rediscover what 50 and 100 hertz sound like, and you're probably going to start boosting or cutting by 3 to 6 dB. So let me just encourage you. When you're mixing, you can do that kind of stuff. You can do crazy EQ moves because you're usually just dealing with one track. So a crazy EQ on the bass won't really affect anything else in the mix, and it's probably, depending on the mix, might be the perfect thing for that bass track to get it to fit in the mix. When you're mastering, if you boost 50 hertz, you're boosting 50 hertz on the acoustic guitar, on the bass, on the kick drum, on the vocal. You're boosting it on everything. And the same goes for all the other frequencies. So whatever you do, if it sounds right, if it sounds good, if it makes you happy, cut it in half and then go back and reevaluate. So if you boosted 50 hertz by 6 dB and you thought it was amazing, go down to 3 dB and see if you can still live with that. Because chances are, maybe go down to 1.5 again. Chances are that 6 dB boost sounds good right now, but if you kind of come down from your cloud of awesome, you'll realize that's a little too much. Same applies to compression too. If you're using some compression on your master when you're mastering, whether it's multiband compression or just single normal compression, it's easy to start doing too much to where it's knocking off 6 to 8 dB of gain reduction when maybe it just needs 1 to 2. Maybe you just need to kiss it with a compressor. Now, sometimes you may need to do that 6 dB boost and you may need to do some seriously aggressive compression to get the sound that you want. I get that. But at least try dialing it back. And if it doesn't work, go back to where you were. But chances are, what I find is when I do that, when I cut it in half, whatever it is that I'm doing, whether it's a boost or a cut, when I dial it back a little bit, it tends to be the more mature, subtle option, which mastering is a lot about doing subtle things like that. All right, we're halfway through the 10 game changers. I hope you've been taking notes and want to write these down and go try them because again, this is a lot of fun. A lot. Each of these kind of brings back all these memories of specific sessions I've done that really helped. Okay, number 6, limit for volume, compress for tone. Now, this is a personal preference, but I found when I start trying to use compression to add volume, where I think, okay, this mix is a dynamic range of about 12. So I want to do maybe 4 dB of gain reduction to get it up to maybe an average level of or dynamic range of about 8. And I tend to think, okay, the compressor is going to do that for me. And every time I've done that, the compressor does too much to the sound. It's just it's the mix starts hurting because I'm squeezing it so much to get those 4 dB out of it. Because if you heavily compress a mix, you can hear it pretty quickly because there's so much sonic information in that mix. Anything you do to it is going to get affected, right? If you don't believe me, just go pull in a mix. Like I said, after you do that fun EQ trick, not really a trick, then slap a compressor on there and just throw some pretty aggressive stuff there. You'll realize the mix falls apart real fast. Now with a limiter, it's not as how do I say this? It can be more subtle because a limiter doesn't really affect the tone. It just grabs those peaks and then lets go pretty quick. So if you use a limiter for your volume, so increase the volume of the mix to whatever level you think it needs to be at and have that feeding into a limiter, then the limiter is going to hit those peaks and going to leave it alone. And then if the mix needs some compression for the tone of the mix, you can put a little bit of compression on there. What I find is something like the Waves SSL bus compressor. If I put that across a mix, even if it's just hitting 2 dB of gain reduction in spots, it just adds a glue and a thickness to the mix that wasn't there before. And I'm sure you have your own tools of choice that you use that do the same deal. It can be pretty powerful. But what I found is if I don't hear something in that mix that's calling to me, man, I need to be compressed, I may not put a compressor on there at all. It may just be EQ and limiting and some other tools that may come into play. But this is a good rule to live by, or at least give it a shot. See if it works. Limit for volume, compress for tone. Number 7, reference tracks aren't stupid. Now, maybe you live and die by the reference track, but I still, to this day, have a hard time making myself pull in something somebody else worked on and comparing my mix to it. I hate comparing because mine always sounds worse, at least initially. Or a more dangerous scenario is I think mine sounds way better. So I'm listening to my master and I listen to next to somebody like Bob Ludwig or somebody, and uh, or Ian Shepard or anybody else, and I think, man, mine sounds so much fuller and brighter and awesomer. Chances are mine is way hyped. And I've got like that Bose effect where the lows and the highs are boosted so much that it to my ears sounds a little better. But if I were to really listen and come out of the clouds, I'd realize, oh, right, mine does not sound like it needs to sound. And if I listened on other systems, that would confirm that. So a reference track will make you sad. That's just a given. Get over that. It'll make you sad, but it will help. And a lot of times for me, it's just basic level stuff, basic tone stuff. Are the low frequencies in my master just way too loud? Well, let me flip over to bringing down the horse uh, from the Wallflowers. Oh, okay, you know what? The bass isn't as loud in that as it is in my master, and this is a similar genre of music. Okay, I'm gonna tone down. I'm gonna tone down that boost that I had on the low end because it sounds great and it's hitting me in the chest, but it doesn't seem to fit this genre. Okay, that wasn't so bad. And you do that. It's a great tool for mixing too, but I feel like I use references more for mastering because it's the final stage. If I don't get it right here, it's not going to get right. And so I run it up against other professional tracks, other professional masters, and compare. If this one came on after that one on the radio or on shuffle on my iPod, would would it be a huge difference in tone that would make me sad, or would it make me happy? Usually it starts off sad and you do some more work and then it starts to move towards happy. So I want you to be happy. You got to go through the sad part first. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. Reference tracks are not stupid. Number 8, slow attack times are your friend. I feel like this is a universal truth no matter what you're doing. There are times where a fast attack time on a compressor is great. But I find more and more as I mix and as I master, those fast attack times bring with them a lot of baggage where they're just cutting off a bunch of punch and dynamic range. Or not dynamic range, just a bunch of the transients get sucked into that fast attack time and they're not allowed to come through. Sometimes you want to do that. On a snare drum, sometimes you want a fast attack so it just sounds like this big whoosh of sound. But sometimes you want to let that punch come through. When you're mastering, especially, err on the side of slower attack times so that the kick and the snare and the drums and the big punchiness of that mix doesn't get lost because you accidentally put a 1 millisecond attack time on your master. So for me, I'm usually if I'm using back to the Waves SSL bus compressor, I've got that thing set as high as it'll go, which is 30 milliseconds. So that's usually my ballpark for regular compression, at least 30 milliseconds. So some of that punch comes through before that compressor starts kicking in. With multiband compression, I'm up to 100 milliseconds because I'm really not trying to use it for a ton of compression. I'm trying to let a lot of it through and do some tone shaping there, but can't get into all of that in a 1 hour webinar. But go err on the side of slow attack times, and I think your masters will thank you for it. Number 9, treat multiband compression like normal compression. Now, if you've never used multiband compression, you're okay. It's not one of those tools that I think is absolutely necessary to, especially when you're learning. I think it's something you can add down the road once you're feeling confident in your abilities, and it is a useful tool. Essentially, multiband compression, if you've never heard of it, is a compressor that is divided up into 3 to 5 or more frequency bands, and each band has its own compressor. So you can compress 0 to 100 hertz differently than you compress 100 to 500 hertz, for example. For me, I use it, and I got this straight from Ian Shepard too. I use it in 3 bands: 0 to 160, 160 to around 2.5K, and then 2.5K up. So lows, mids, highs. And then compress each I don't use different thresholds, different attack times, different release times for each section. I have it all essentially as one compressor where I bring the threshold down of everything. And then as the music comes through that multiband compressor, when there are sections where the mids are louder because the vocal is singing, then that mid range is going to be compressed a little more than the lows and the highs. When the kick drum really hits hard before that final chorus, then the lows might have a little bit more compression than everything else. And it can add as kind of for me, it's more of a corrective tool to balance things out that weren't maybe balanced as well as they should have been in the mix. But if you start to go in and you use a different attack threshold and release time for the lows and then the mids and then the highs, things are going to start to fall apart quick. Now, maybe it's just I'm not smart enough to keep up with all those changes. But for me personally, when I treat it like a normal compressor that just happens to treat each band a little differently, but everything else stays the same, it works so much better. So much better. I see a few more questions coming up. We're going to get to those in a second. We're almost done here. Number 10, mastering is a creative process, so enjoy it. I used to dread mastering. Absolutely just dread the thought of doing it. It seems boring. I can't go in and adjust the kick drum. I have to deal with the whole master. Once I finally just got over that and sat there and worked on good music and was able to see how the little subtle changes that I'm doing are making a big impact on this mix or on this album, I started to realize that mastering is a hugely creative process, partly because you are so limited in what you can do. And you've got to take these fairly simple tools and apply them in a way that gets the result that you want. And you're very limited in that. And I feel like limitations are a great way to force you to be creative and to force you to do more musical things than you would have done before, which is I feel like a huge point. So it may not be a game changer for you, but if you are freaked out by mastering, try to just enjoy the next one. Just do things instead of worrying about doing everything wrong. Take a few of the points that you learned tonight and just try it, apply it to something you're working on, and just try to have fun. Don't overthink things. Just set things up and just start to get it. See how quickly you can get it to where you're enjoying that song again. And it's at a good level and all that stuff. If you try to over analyze and over process it and make it this scientific endeavor, it will not be as good as if you are enjoying the music, moved by the music, and having a good time. That's what I think anyway. So there you go. Those are my 10 game-changing mastering lessons. I'm going to take a sip of water, then we're going to dive in to some Q&A and hopefully answer some of your specific questions. Uh, I love water. Okay, so I've got a bunch of questions here. If you asked one earlier in the webinar, I might be able to get to it. You may want to ask it again because I've got a humongo list sitting in front of me now that I'm going to have to look at. So bear with me on that. So I'm just going to start from and just go through them. So hopefully this has been helpful for you and given you some ideas. I really wanted this to be a beneficial time for you. And I've got something to tell you about here in a few minutes, but we've got at least about 10 minutes to do some Q&A. So I'm going to try to blow through these quickly. And if I don't get to your question, shoot me an email or send me one through the Ask Joe podcast, and I'll try to cover it on a future podcast as well. Okay, so Mike has a real simple question. What's the difference between a finished mix and a finished master? I think you're just meaning like a technical definition. A finished mix is usually a 24-bit wave file that has been mixed. It may or may not have compression on the master fader. Um, Either way is fine. I like to do some compression on my mixes. And then a finished master has been put through this whole process we've talked about with things like EQ, limiting to get it up to a commercial level without killing it. And also, typically, the mastering process involves making sure it can sound good on multiple systems and will sound good on your earbuds and also on your car speaker and all that stuff. A lot of that stuff you do in mixing as well, but the finished master is the final. It's done. It's ready to go to the public. That's why when I do an album, I usually have somebody else do the mastering if it's my own music because I'm so close to the music. I need somebody else to put that final touch on it. Jeff, I see the last half of your question, but I don't see the first half. So, oh, you were never mind. You were completing my sentence, which is awesome. Matt Wahlberg was here. Hey, buddy. Okay. Jeremy, my buddy Jeremy says, on a more technical note, DDP files, are they necessary? Any resources on how to create them? DDP is cool. I don't know what it stands for. Probably digital distribution packet or something like that. I have no idea, but you can Google it and you can tell me how to Google it later. DDP is a cool file where most mastering houses, I know disc makers uses it, and a lot of smaller CD manufacturers will use it. It's essentially a single file that has a huge long WAV file of all the songs, and then a bunch of data files that tell them the song order, all the line, all the what's the word I'm looking for? The data for each of the songs, and has all that information in one spot. And it's kind of a standard format, so you can just upload this DDP file, and then they'll take that and drop it in. So instead of, if you've ever done something on blah blah blah, what's it called? On disc makers where you upload each WAV file individually, it can work, but if there was a cool fade from one song to the next, that might not actually make it on the CD. So having just a DDP file from your mastering engineer, you can just upload that directly. I've done that for clients where I'll upload the DDP file to the server of the company that's doing their mastering, and then they don't have to even send anything in, which is kind of nice for them and convenient. Sydney, what about spatial widening plugins? I don't use them. I've not used them. At least I've used them in mixing sometimes for specific tracks. I don't know, Timothy, you asked about this as well. I just don't use them because I found when I start widening things out, it starts to mess with my stereo image and starts to make things sound thin and start to potentially introduce phase issues. So I just leave it alone. Now, does that mean it's a bad tool? Not at all. I'm a simple guy. That tends to get outside of my comfort level. So maybe when I do this webinar again in 20 years, 22 years, maybe I'll be using that and you can ask me again. Sorry, the quick question about DDP. Most mastering software will do a DDP for you, um, where it create the file. Studio One Pro does it. Richard says Wavelab does it. I'm sure a lot of them will do it. Also, thank you, Javier. It stands for Disk Description Protocol. I was wrong on every single word, which is awesome. Okay. Nelson says, I know it depends, but do I EQ during the mix or when I'm mastering? Same for reverb. Um, I try to mix and do everything I need to do to get it to where I want it to be. For me personally, that means I almost never EQ the master fader. I get those changes in the mix itself. That said, if I get to the very end of the mix and I'm loving it, but I feel like it just needs a little, maybe the entire mix has a little too much thickness in that low mid range, then maybe I will put an EQ there. But rarely will I do that. I usually deal with that in the mix. As far as reverb, that's always a mix thing for me. I've put reverb on during mastering a handful of times when it really needed it and they left it so dry it just was uncomfortable. So I've added it there. But generally, I like to do that. That's a mixed decision in my book. Good questions, everybody. Let's see. Lewis says he uses my tracks as a reference. That's nice of you, but I wouldn't recommend it. Bill is asking about how do you reference in your DAW. For me, the way I do, talking about reference tracks, the way I do it is I have my way's a little different. You have to figure out your own way of doing it. I run iTunes through a separate channel on my mixer than my DAW, so I can just flip between the two. So I have iTunes just playing, looping a song while I'm working on a song, and then I can just flip between them at any point. If you're mastering, you literally can just import a WAV file into your mastering session and just click over there and listen to it whenever you want to. That's the simplest way to do it. It's a little requires more clicky clicking, but it's totally easy to do. Let's see. Man, y'all have a lot of questions. This is awesome. Wes is asking, do you use visual frequency, like some kind of frequency analyzer, or do you just listen when you master? Mastering is the one time where I will try to use a little more, uh, use a spectrum analyzer a little bit more. I don't usually ever use it when I'm mixing, but in mastering, I can kind of flip between songs on an album and can quickly see, okay, this song looks like this, and I go to the next one, which is a similar song, and I see a big difference, a big hump at 500 hertz that wasn't there on the other song, and I'm also hearing that. And so it's more. I don't use it as a tool. I'll usually listen, and if I hear something's out of whack, maybe, or I think it's out of whack, maybe I'll check it on the meter to see if that confirms it for me, and it might help me see, if there's a big issue in a certain range that I'm missing, a big dip or a big boost that I'm hearing, but I'm not sure where it is that can help me kind of hone in on it. What mastering tools in Pro Tools create DDP files? I don't know of any. You'll need a separate mastering software to create those files. Um, Wavelab does it. Studio One Pro does it. I'm sure lots of others do it. Jeff is asking any opinions on Ozone or Slate FGX or other mastering plugins. I don't because I've not used them. I know Graham Cochran uses both, I believe, and he raves about them. But Ozone, if I were to get something, it would probably be Ozone because it has so much in just one plugin, which I like that ease of use there. Timothy has a great question. What is the most troublesome frequency area you find when mastering? Where do you find you most often have to cut or boost to balance your tone? Great, great question. And this, I don't think this is unique to me, but I found that um, everything below 250 hertz is kind of like the Wild West. You never know what you're going to get down there, and usually that's where a lot of the problems in the mix come in for me, or when I'm mastering. There's too much down there, or there's not enough, and I'm trying to beat it into submission. And so that's where a lot of my when I'm first having issues, that's usually where it is. One thing I've been doing lately, I learned this from Craig Anderton when I was down presenting at Presonosphere a few months back. He does this thing where if a mix, a lot of times with digital equipment, where everything's done very cleanly, you end up with really bright tracks. Everything's super bright. And so the mix ends up super bright. And something he'll do is he'll put a low pass filter or a high roll off filter on the master, and it'll bring it down to maybe 15K. And so it's just rolling off the very tip top of the high frequencies, but it has this softening effect that almost, he said, a lot of guys will say, dude, did you use tubes on that master because it sounds so thick and warm and awesome when you just rolled off some of those excessive highs? So that's something I've been experimenting more with. If the mix comes in and it just has a little bit too much just hotness in that top end, you can certainly overdo it, but it actually has been an interesting technique that I've applied a couple times now. Drake, what volume level do you master at? And do you check your master at different levels and environments? So you mean specifically like the volume coming out of my speakers? I've got everything calibrated to around, what is it? Around 73, I think, dB. Um, I don't know if that's the accurate measurement. That was just with the with the whatever sound volume app that I got on my iPad. But that was roughly what I felt like what I was comfortable at. I don't like to do it really loud. It just hurts my ears, and I can't do it for very long. So I prefer lower volumes. I'll check stuff at louder volumes and quieter volumes and on big speakers and small speakers, sure. But I usually hang out at that 73 to 75 range. Um, what's your philosophy for choosing song order for an album? So the order of the songs. Man, I defer to somebody else. Any album I've done, I've got an order in mind that I'll do, and then I'll ask my brother-in-law, my bass player, and he actually has some really good ideas. So you want to put some good stuff at the front end, but you want it to be a whole journey. You don't want to listen to the first four songs and stop listening. So yeah, I'm not the guy to ask about that. Javier, is mastering only done in one wave file of the song or on the master fader of the original session? That's a good question. For me, in my opinion, mastering is about the entire album. So a mastering session in my book is some sort of setup that has each wave file of the finished stereo master in a session together that you're doing all the processing to. It doesn't make sense for me to do it on my master fader of my mix because that there's too many other options. I can go just the kick drum. I can go remix that vocal. I need to just be mastering when I'm mastering. So that's what I like to do. Okay, great questions, folks. I'm going to jump in, and this last thing I wanted to talk to you about that I think is super duper cool, and I hope you will too. If you want to dive deeper into this, if I've piqued your interest and you've got a bunch of questions, you're going to hopefully, first of all, try the stuff that I told you. If you don't do anything else, and you just try the things that I've shown you tonight, I promise you're going to have improvements. But if you do want to dive deeper from actually my buddy Ian, then check out Ian Shepherd's Home Mastering Masterclass. It's a class that he does maybe a couple times a year, maybe just once a year. I can't remember the last time he did it. It actually might have been a year ago, where he essentially talks all about mastering specifically for us home studio folks. So it's an 8-week online class. It's all about mastering in a home studio. One of the cool features is he did use one of my songs on week 5. So it's essentially 8 weeks. Each week there's a different song that he masters and shows you how he did it, and kind of features a different tool that he kind of really employed in that particular master. So what's cool about it is he does a master in Pro Tools and Studio One and Wavelab and whatever else software there's out there for mastering. He really tries to cover a lot of bases and a lot of different tools, and there's a crazy uh, mix of different styles of music as well, which just he just did a fantastic job putting it all together. So it does feature a song from me if you want to hear that. It's a pretty cool tune. And there's also some bonus goodies that he's offering. There's 2 versions you can get, and the more expensive one actually includes his home mastering EQ videos, which I mentioned earlier, that kind of were mind blowing as far as learning how to hear different frequencies when you're mastering and which ones to focus on. And then also his multiband compression ebook, which was kind of like my manual for when I do use multiband compression. I do exactly what he said, and it works. It's really cool. I feel a little bit sad that I don't figure that part out on my own, but he gave me suggestions and they work, and so I just do it. So if you want to check that out, I've got an affiliate link. So that means he's actually cuts me in on it, which is over at joelikes.com/HMM. And it's not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's super expensive, but it's not cheap. It'll run you. It's in British pounds, so you have to convert that. But it's well worth it if you're wanting to do any mastering. One paid mastering gig as a result of your improved skills would totally pay for the class and much more. But it's just one of those things. Ian has a knack for this. He's been doing it for well over a decade as a professional, 40, 50, 60 hours a week for years mastering music. He knows what he's doing. That's why I haven't created a mastering product myself, because his stuff is so good. I don't need to, and he's better at it than me. And I love promoting his thing because it's just such good stuff. So if you're into this, you want to really develop your mastering skills in 2014, check it out. joelikes.com/HMM for home mastering masterclass. And I'll actually send that link out here on the webinar too, so you got it. Because heaven forbid I make you type something. And boom, there it is. So I just sent that to you. And thanks again for being a part of this webinar. I really appreciate it. Thanks for being a subscriber of the Home Studio Corner and for coming out and asking good questions. I'll probably stick around a little bit after this to answer a few more questions for you, just for those of you who are kind enough to stick around to the end. But definitely check out Ian's class. It is very cool. Definitely worth your time. It's worth at least just going over there and looking at it and seeing if it's right for you. I don't want you to get it if you're not really interested in learning about mastering. But if that's you, you're to the point where you're frustrated and you really want to get to that kind of a next level, it's definitely one really good option that I think you should consider. So thanks again for listening, watching this video if you're watching this later, and I really appreciate it, and see you around.